Hi, thanks very much. We are honored tonight to have the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project coming to speak with us today, Susan Chira. She spent almost 40 years at the New York Times working both as a reporter and an editor, and she was part of the Pulitzer Prize team that recently won the 2018 prize focusing on sexual harassment. Incredible work. And thank you very much for that, Susan. I'm a big fan of the Marshall Project. I have been for a long time, and but I'm hoping that maybe you could start with just explaining to some people who might be less familiar with your organization about the nonprofit and what it does.
Yes, thanks so much, Jennifer, for that kind introduction, and I'm very happy to be here. The Marshall Project is a nonprofit journalism news site that has as its mission writing about criminal justice and the intersection of immigration with the criminal justice system. It was founded in 2014 by Neil Barsky, who is a journalist turned financier who was motivated in part by the issue of mass incarceration and felt that the news outlets that he consumed did not pay as much attention to this burning issue as he would like. So he had the foresight to hire Bill Keller, the former executive editor of the New York Times, as its founding editor, and I succeeded Bill when he retired. The Marshall Project is small but mighty, as I think of it. We have a total team of 40, of whom we have 17 reporters and 7 editors, including a very robust group of people who examine criminal justice data and analyze it, as well as experts in a whole range of criminal justice issues. And we try to focus on areas that other news outlets haven't had the ability and the time to penetrate. So we've written a great deal about all aspects of the criminal justice system, from juvenile justice. We do a lot of work with conditions of incarceration, and we have a number of writers who contribute to us from behind bars. So we are very much deeply involved in trying to shine a light on systemic injustices in the criminal justice system. And as it happens, the combination of COVID-19 and the recent death of George Floyd have shown again the persistence of these terrible racial and economic inequities that permeate the American justice system.
Well, it couldn't be a more opportune time to have you to speak to journalists about what you do and the type of work you do. Just one other thing about the Marshall Project, what percentage of your work is published sort of on your website compared to partnerships that you do?
Right. We try to partner everything we write because we are getting a more and more robust audience that will come to our Marshall Project website. But the more people we can partner with, the other news outlets, the more people can see our work. And so we have more than 140 different news organizations we partner with, from the Washington Post and the Atlantic magazine to a whole range of regional and local news organizations, because one of the things we're very dedicated to is, as local journalism is more and more under threat, criminal justice is very much controlled by the states and localities in this country. So we want to reach audiences everywhere, including places where they may not have a very robust local news organization, helping them keep an eye on what is happening in their home states or counties.
Well, that's great to know. And probably later on in the conversation, I imagine many of us would like to know more about how we could partner with you, because
we are open.
You do fantastic work, and it would be a thrill to do that type of thing. I thought we could just kind of get right in, as we're all very aware, this is a crazy period of time, as you just said, between COVID and the outbreaks in the prison and the protests around the country. I thought you could start with your organization just co-published a piece with 538 titled "Why So Many Police Are Handling the Protests Wrong," that just came out this afternoon. I thought it would be a good place to start if you could talk about what that story is and tell us why it's important.
Yes, one of the things we try to do is we try to go deeply under the surface. And so 538, which is a terrific news organization that focuses a great deal on data and research, had a really smart science reporter who began looking at studies of police use of force and what happened. And then she came to us and said, can you help me? Because what I'm seeing is study after study shows that when police use force, it does not, in fact, stem demonstrations, it inflames demonstrations, and it makes situations escalate, as we've seen just this week around the country. And so the science of showing that over 50 years of studies have shown that use of force almost inevitably leads to worse violence and, a great deal of harm. Our reporter Jamiles Larte, who has written a great deal about policing, talked to a lot of former police chiefs and criminologists about what they've seen on the ground. And together we tried to show there are many, many reasons why use of force is so persistent, despite the fact that empirically it doesn't work. And they range from the fact that the training on alternatives to force is very spotty. The culture into police departments, understandably, police feel embattled, they feel attacked, they feel frightened. They are trained to respond with force to shut it down, but that training very seldom extends to de-escalation. That is, trying to figure out how to talk someone down, how not to resort to a deadly weapon, how, while feeling under threat, to try to diffuse the threat. These things are hard, they're challenging, and they're not easy to pull off. But so that the training is often insufficient, the belief in it is that it doesn't work. The culture of a police department is often, you come to the aid of your brothers and or sisters, and you back them no matter what. So that even as one of my former colleagues at the Times, who's now at ProPublica, wrote a fantastic article that was kind of an anatomy of a police officer doing something right. That he did not respond with force when he and an officer were threatened. He was able to talk the person down. Everyone went off unscathed. He was ostracized by his comrades and eventually fired because they all thought he should have used force. So this kind of cultural, police unions have often been quite antagonistic to this. And so we kind of tried to explore both what the studies show and why there's been continual resistance.
It's such an important topic, obviously. And was there any ability to see if force has grown over the last couple of years? Because it definitely seems from what we're looking like.
I think you can look, look, there's a long and terrible history in the United States of police force. If you look at the demonstrations in the 1960s, I would say, however, since 9/11, one trend that Marshall Project has written about, as well as many other outlets, has been the militarization of police. They were given military-grade weapons, combat gear, tanks, and other kinds of army-like equipment, and this was partly to combat what was seen as a terror threat that might attack American cities, but it's ended up being used, of course, overwhelmingly against Americans, and particularly Americans of color, as we've seen.
It's been so unsettling to watch the news right now, watching police running over people with horses, with cars, shooting at journalists. One of the articles I read today was about a Los Angeles Times reporter who said that she has covered the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and this was the first time she's ever been shot at by a police officer. What can you I think journalists right now are finding themselves in the middle of this, and what can you say to those of us who are out there on the streets doing this work? What would you advise them?
Well, of course, and I know that the journalists who cover these protests would agree with me. Of course, we know that the protesters themselves are the most vulnerable, and they have no power But journalists themselves being deliberately targeted is a very ominous turn. And we have seen some really terrible examples of rubber bullets, someone blinded in an eye, other people beaten and attacked despite clearly, showing press credentials. And so I would say one very important resource, I happen to be on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and they have been putting out some very valuable information and guidance, which I would urge people to follow. I mean, the challenge is, you want to always know, you want to know what your escape route is. You want to have a way to run back if the police are turning on you. You kind of want to have the consciousness of when you might need to run. And the problem is that often in protests and demonstrations, well, first of all, any journalist needs to be in the center of the action to record the action, but also crowd movements are very unpredictable, and the police in several of these cities appear to have sort of treated journalists just like the protesters and said, everyone clear out, which is an attempt, frankly, to suppress coverage of brutal tactics. And so journalists are tempted then, as we all understand our mission to be, to stay and record abuses that are taking place. And so it puts them on a collision course sometimes with the authorities. And we've all seen this horrible footage of the CNN crew being arrested, other people being trampled. So I think you have to have sort of situational awareness. You have to know you're running risks. You have to bring whatever protective equipment you can, for tear gas, goggles, masks, in addition for COVID, because we're all trying to go out when we venture out, protected, because we are in this horrible confluence of the coronavirus, and so that any protest is also dangerous from a public health perspective. So journalists have multiple challenges, as do the protesters.
I was wondering what you think about, I mean, I know as long-term professional journalists, we strive always to be completely fair and impartial, but when the President of the United States is calling the mainstream media the enemy of the people, how do you react to that? Is that just provoking, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I look at it is journalists of my type, and so there is a very honorable field of advocacy journalism, that doesn't take as its marching orders a kind of neutrality or but I come from the tradition of trying not to take a political stance. I would say, though, that when the President of the United States uses words that are associated with treason to talk about the press, that's inciting violence. And even the publisher of the New York Times, as well as many other news outlets, have condemned those remarks, not from a political opposition to a Republican president or President Trump himself, but from a concern that this is gravely inappropriate and endangers journalists whose rights are protected by our Constitution to report what we see. And we're, I don't want to be self-important, but we were conceived by the founding fathers as absolutely indispensable to democracy. And if we are prevented from recording what we see, the public will not know. And so I think it's appropriate to condemn remarks that incite violence or endanger the lives of journalists without making a political position about, the president himself.
Have you seen, or do you worry that this type of violence towards journalists also will affect the coverage?
Well, I think, what I would say I've drawn in my past, I was foreign editor of the New York Times for 8 years during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would say there are a lot of analogs toward covering protests or demonstrations or movements in those countries. And, you have to try. Journalists are human. One gets angry. But I think we're all very capable, and we're trained to say, to not let that distort what we write. That is how we're schooled. And I think we can both, I think you have to be very, very careful, for example, how we describe these protests. You know, I think responsible journalists have been very careful to point out that the majority have been peaceful, that at some points, particularly at night, there has been violence or looting, and that there's also been considerable police violence that needs to be documented. So you don't refuse to note that stores were smashed up because you're angry that the police have turned on you. That's not what a journalist does.
Yeah, and I think probably starting from the first thing you mentioned about how studies show that the more violence turned to you, you may become, more people will be fighting for the rights of the people they're reporting about.
I think, for us, it's just very important. I think one of the tragedies of this political era, and it's been going on a long time, is there is a diminishment of trust in journalism, and journalists are seem to be put in camps, our side, their side, favorable to me, favorable to you. I recognize that we're in a very polarized moment. I still hope to be able, one thing about criminal justice that's really interesting and heartening is that actually the calls for reforming criminal justice come from conservative groups just as much as liberal groups. There are many conservative groups who are horrified at mass incarceration from a libertarian perspective and from a financial perspective, just as there are people who call for prison abolition from the left because they see it as an inhumane and terribly counterproductive way to see justice done. So I think there are many, many paths, and we can try to stay open to a range of solutions and a range of perspectives.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work. And one of the other most recent stories that you folks at the Marshall Project did was about after George Floyd was murdered, that you looked into what has been happening or not happening in Minneapolis. And I hope you could talk a little bit about that story.
I was proud of that story because we have reporters at the Marshall Project who are real experts in criminal justice. They were very familiar with the extremely damaging record of the Minneapolis Police Department over many, many years. So what we did very quickly is we pulled together a deep look at a sort of 10 to 15 year period where there were police killings of unarmed men of color. There were federal investigations, federal commissions, local investigations, all concluding that Minneapolis had really severe structural problems, and recommendations were made and theoretically adopted that there should be a much more robust way to rid the department of people who had track records as the policeman who killed George Floyd had a litany record of complaints, as did one of the other officers who stood by. I also had a long record of complaints. But these people were never pushed out of the Minneapolis Police Department. So, and furthermore, so that their whole attempt to identify and push out cops with bad records faltered and failed. They did not really have a robust discipline method that would really say, okay, you have this chance, we're going to give you teaching about other techniques, and if you fail that, out you go. That was left by the by. There was also a real systemic failure to look at what is allowed in terms of chokeholds and neck restraints. Minneapolis did put into effect a policy that valued the sanctity of life that some people thought would have prevented this kind of pressure that would in fact cause a death. But it was inconsistently applied. And so at one point, Minneapolis was thought to have been a center of reform, but the reality was not enough was done. This kind of behavior went on, and it led to the tragedy that we saw.
Such important work, and it's also so much about what enterprise and investigative reporting is so important, of saying not only was this just one thing, but what are all the systemic flaws that brought us to this place. I mean, your sense that this is a nationwide problem.
Oh, absolutely. It's obvious. I mean, look at Ferguson. All the issues that came out in Ferguson that prompted the Black Lives Matter movement. One of the reasons we have so much rage today is that we have seen this for decades in our American life, where you have people of color particularly, and statistics document that. We're going to be publishing a story tomorrow that looks again at issues of racial discrimination in arrests that were made during the coronavirus lockdown period. And you will see it tomorrow morning, and it will show racial disparities. But I would say that the issue of police departments acting with excessive force that results in death or grave physical harm is in police departments all across the country, has been repeatedly so. There are legal issues that have made it very, very hard to actually prosecute police because they're given the benefit of the doubt because they do work in danger, but it's been extremely difficult to prosecute. So there's been a sense of impunity. And even when the Department of Justice would look into these kinds of systemic abuses and put so-called consent decrees in which the department agreed to have a federal monitor and reform practices, many of those departments have not sufficiently transformed. So that these are very, very deeply rooted problems that have not been solved, and that is what is fueling a lot of the rage. You know, people of color and others are sick and tired of seeing the same incident happen again and again without any apparent improvement.
I know you said this, I think, earlier when we spoke, that you can't really, foresee what the future will bring, but people start talking about a tipping point and that nobody can stand. And where do you think can you say in history whether we've reached that point?
No, I'm going to say what I said before, which is that I don't believe journalists are any good at predictions. And I think, who knows, some people thought Ferguson was a tipping point and it wasn't. I don't know what to say. I think this is an inflection point. This is a point where you see a great deal of rage, and there's a great deal of, early public opinion polls that I've heard about, I can't verify how accurate, suggest that there may be more public understanding of this issue than there was at the time of Ferguson. But I really don't know, because it requires a great deal of action and follow through that has not been the case in the past. So I'm not going to predict, but I do think we're at a signature moment in our history. Whether things will change or not remains to be seen.
So I wanted to shift a little to the prisons and jails, which
yes.
You also cover a lot, which is something I didn't introduce myself also at the beginning of this. I work at WGBH at the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, and I teach journalism at Boston University. And I've spent most of the time over the last 3 months covering the outbreak of coronavirus in the state prisons and jails. And so I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that. And you're nationwide, you're looking at it nationwide. You've done a great website showing where the outbreaks are across the country. I'm wondering, in terms of this idea of sort of focus, part of coronavirus has sort of brought a focus on some of the weakest parts of our society, including the prisons and jails. And have you noticed since this time, has there been more of a focus on your website? Are you getting more people reading it and paying attention because of this time?
Yes. Thank you for alluding. We're very proud. We developed at the Marshall Project what we believe to be the most comprehensive tracker of outbreaks, infection rates, deaths, and infection of staff of all the states, every prison system in the country, so that we update it weekly so that you can see and you can chart what the outbreaks are. And we have seen more people coming to our site in the last 2 months than historically, because I think this has, just as coronavirus has exposed so many deep and structural inequities in our country, right? We've seen the racial disparities in public health and in the health of populations that make some more vulnerable to the severity and potential death from coronavirus. You've seen the fact that there are the economic inequality, so that there are some workers who are forced essentially to take more risks. And you've seen the fact that some of the most concentrated cases of coronavirus are in prisons. The biggest outbreaks are in prisons and nursing homes in terms of concentration of an event. And by the way, if you hear pot banging and cheering in the background, I'm coming to you from New York, where at 7 p.m. every day we cheer our healthcare workers, who are, and every day my heart swells to hear it because they've been so valiant. But having said that, so I think people understand that prisons are petri dishes for infection, the way nursing homes are. You know, it's very difficult to practice social distancing. People don't have protective equipment, or haven't had. Some have been provided. For example, hand sanitizer was something that was forbidden because it had rubbing alcohol, and there was a concern that they could be made bootleg into alcohol. So there have been all kinds of challenges in trying to contain coronavirus. And one thing about people who are incarcerated in the United States is that there's many, many people with underlying health conditions. There are many elderly people, and these are all high risk areas for coronavirus. So there's a great deal of tragedy that has been unfolding behind bars. And we are trying to chronicle it, as you and others are, and we have noticed the public paying attention. I think it has heightened concern about, because the other thing that people need to remember is that, particularly for jails, and jails, remember, are places where people who are not yet convicted of a crime or people who are convicted of relatively minor crime are held. So jails have a great deal of flow in and out. So if there's a COVID outbreak in a jail, that COVID outbreak is immediately in your community, as is the case with the staff who might come to and from any prison. So it affects those who are incarcerated, but it also affects communities and can be a source of spread. So there's a stake for the general population. In addition to the sort of moral and ethical questions, there's also a public health question.
I've found in Massachusetts that the staff have been really reluctant to speak out here. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about nationally the types of stories or stories you've heard from workers in the system about what it's like.
I think a lot of workers are really terrified, and they feel, we have talked to a number, and a few have written for us. They're very frightened. You know, these jobs, one thing about many prisons is that, depending on the locality, in many cases they're the major source of employment, particularly in rural areas. The jobs are not particularly well paid. They're very dangerous. And yet they are very, very needed. And so people are afraid to risk that income. They don't feel protected. We have had whistleblowers of staff talk to us about conditions in multiple places in the country.
In Massachusetts, they've been on lockdown for, I think, now over a month. I mean, all over the system in the state prisons. Is that true nationwide?
Yes. Yes. Many, many, many prisons are on lockdown because they see it as a way of, for example, visitors were forbidden as a way to try to prevent the spread. One of the tragedies is that often if someone develops an illness, they're sent to solitary, they're isolated. Now, of course, people should be isolated so they can't transmit the disease, but being in solitary is another form of terrible mental distress. So a lot of the ways in which prisons are coping with this compound the suffering for those who are inside.
I've heard that they're very concerned about the mental health of people who have been locked in their cells for 23 hours a day for weeks on end.
It is, studies have shown that it is a terrible inflictor of stress and mental anguish.
So you had another interesting story recently about how studying prisons and jails could be an examination into herd mentality.
Herd immunity, I think, right? Yeah, exactly. So actually it was very interesting. No problem. Well, one of the things that we realize is, of course, we know so little about coronavirus. And tragically, because prisons have had such large outbreaks, epidemiologists and virologists believe that they could learn something by studying these outbreaks to understand transmission and the question of herd immunity, which you guys all who are listening probably know, but that's the idea when a sufficient percentage of the population has already had the virus, that it would be much less easier for it to be wildly contagious. And usually herd immunity is reached at something like 80 or 90% of a population. Well, there are prisons where 80% of those incarcerated have had the virus. So you can also study what happens when you reach this level of herd immunity that the United States is nowhere near able to be reached right now. So I think there are a lot of potential lessons to be learned, but one of the things that the researchers are very, very concerned about is that there's a terrible history of forced experimentation on those who are incarcerated. And there are a lot of ethical questions about how you would proceed with these studies. So people are being very careful, but they recognize there are lessons to be learned about coronavirus from studying prison outbreaks.
That's interesting. Of course, the advocates are mostly saying, let's get everybody who doesn't need to be there out.
Right.
Rather than study
the answer would be, right. Well, you could study, even after the fact. In other words, you could sort of look at transmission rates and so on. But yes, obviously, those who fall into, advocates of decarceration, of trying to put fewer people in prison and jail to begin with, to release people for compassionate or other reasons. There's been a lot of attempts to get people out of jail and prison because it's, for some, a death sentence simply being there. And so we have seen releases. Honestly, we're also trying to track that. Many fewer than you might think given the public health risk. But there have been some states that have adopted releases or have chosen not to prosecute certain kinds of offenses or make them punishable by prison for the time being. That is what a lot of criminal justice reformers would like to see baked into society, and time will tell whether this continues or is a Band-Aid for now.
Have you seen any really standout states that are sort of being praised?
Well, Pennsylvania is one that comes to mind that let out a lot of people incarcerated. And we're still looking into other areas, but that comes to mind.
And what can you say, considering the topic that we started with, about race and COVID in the jails and prisons?
Absolutely. Just as the coronavirus has, and this combination of, George Floyd's death on top of so many other deaths, coronavirus has shown a very harsh and revealing spotlight on race. Obviously, people who are incarcerated are disproportionately non-white. That is, African American, Latinx, and other non-white groups. So they're disproportionately incarcerated, they're disproportionately infected, they're disproportionately, as we've seen in public health, having serious bouts of COVID, including disproportionate deaths. We have this tracker that I mentioned where every week we call all the 50 states and Puerto Rico, and we ask about rates of infection and death. We've been asking them, are you breaking down infection and death rates by race? And most of them either do not keep those figures, will not tell us. And I think that's, frankly, in criminal justice statistics, I've learned a lot of people don't collect what they don't want to know or they don't want others to know. So we are working hard at trying to understand better the differing infection rates by race, but very few systems are revealing that data, and we're trying to keep up the pressure for them to do so.
That's so interesting and such a good idea. I'm going to hope to do that in Massachusetts now. So it's 7:10. We have about 20 minutes, and we wanted to open it up to folks if they have some questions. There's a few here in the chat room. And so I would love to see and anyone else who has any questions, feel free. I think what we'll do is if you could put them in the chat room, and then I'll just call on you to ask would be probably the best thing to do. So, actually, so I think the first question actually was just answered, which is COVID-19 falling harder on Black prisoners?
We believe so, but we don't. We believe that the disproportionate presence. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, Jennifer. I saw there was more to the question. So from JN, would you like to ask the question yourself? You can unmute yourself, I think.
Sure. I was just wondering if your reporters are seeing any delays or denials in responses to public records requests as a result of the coronavirus.
Absolutely. We have had many states say when we have filed, Freedom of Information Act requests or public records requests. They've said we're not fulfilling them for the coronavirus, we're understaffed, we're not answering. So we've had a lot of stonewalling or people alleging that they don't have the capacity to address it. It's a big issue.
Is there anything to do about that?
You know, we're trying to see if there's some way to file suit or, you know, follow up. It's tricky right now. The courts are shut down in effect in many different places, although some states are beginning to reopen, so we'll have to see.
Okay, and also if you have a question, also please introduce yourself and where you work if you're or a freelancer or if you're a journalist, that would be great. And JN, feel free to ask another question if you'd like. We got one from Adam Sennett, who from SPJ. Adam, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you said the Marshall Project works with writers behind bars. How does the Marshall Project go about doing that?
Yes, well, actually, this is something from its inception. We reached out. One of the remarkable things that I've seen, having not experienced this before joining the Marshall Project, is that there are just beautiful essayists behind bars right now, very eloquent, very thoughtful, who take courses, work on writing. And so we began reaching out to people who work with them, and we've developed a group of some contributing writers, but we also make it clear that we're open to solicitations. A lot of people write us letters from prison and talk about their experiences, and so we will follow up. We have to do this either by snail mail or by, there's snail mail, but there's also various email, monitored email ways of communicating so that we can sometimes go through email or by phone calls. So we work on drafts with people who are incarcerated, and we publish every Friday something called Life Inside, which is written by someone involved with the criminal justice system, often someone who is incarcerated. So we publish them on our site under the Life Inside rubric, and they are really well worth a read. They are extraordinary.
I would imagine you fact check them like you would fact check any writer.
Yes, we do have a fact checker who works with us. So there are some things that are difficult to verify or we can't include them, but they are professionally fact checked. We don't fact check our more frequent journalism, but we fact check, you know, at like a daily newspaper doesn't fact check. It's, when I say fact check, like with having a professional fact checker go through it as you would a magazine piece. Reporters are expected to fact check their work, but we hire a fact checker for the Life Insides.
That's really great. All right, Leah, Samuel, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, thank you. A few years ago, I covered a tuberculosis outbreak in Alabama, which some public health officials and people in the town that I visited believed started in prisons, actually.
Yeah.
And had spread in prisons and was being spread to the public as people in prison were being released. And so I'm wondering if you're seeing any indication for a post-COVID-19 world, if there is such a thing, wherein this is being avoided or prevented in some way in terms of dealing with reducing the number or keeping or preventing prisoners from having this or from getting the kind of treatment that they need in order for it to not be. Yeah. I guess I'm thinking that that even if we get this under control on the outside, if people are, we thought TB was a thing of the past too, right?
Yeah.
So I think you can kind of see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think one of the things we don't yet have a great picture of is how effectively public health is being transformed within prisons. You know, we're still trying to understand, we're getting a lot of accounts and anecdotes, and we do think that the severity of COVID-19 has caused many prison systems to try to do better in terms of providing some protective masks or some ability to wash hands, but it's very sporadic and spotty. In Alabama, as you know, Leah, so well, is one of the really, really worst systems in the country. And so I don't think we know yet exactly whether this will alter or has in fact been of a sufficient level to prevent those outbreaks and spreads. And I think we're still, one of the things we found is that there were a lot of inconsistencies in testing prison staff, and staff are a vector of transmission, right? So a number of prison systems don't seem to have robust testing regimen for staff. So we're seeing a lot of holes in that, public health system that at the moment don't lead me to feel optimistic that this will become any kind of transformative moment. But, I think it's too early to say.
I think you're right. It's so eye-opening. I think people have been really surprised when you read these stories and realize that prisoners, in Massachusetts before now had to pay for soap.
Oh, absolutely.
They're not running water. It's shocking.
And many don't have running water, or the water isn't hot, or, or the soap is, maybe their allocation is 1 bar of soap a month, if that. So if they want more, they have to get someone to send the money to buy it at commissary. There are many, many things like that.
I think in that way, it has been very eye-opening.
Yeah.
We have a question from Gabe. Gabe Stern. There we go.
Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. So yeah, I was just wondering, when reporting on the juvenile justice system, I guess one thing it's important to avoid is especially extraction journalism, and I guess
absolutely,
just covering it differently than you would with adults. So just there a lot of repeated angles to criminal justice reporting. Are there any that are particularly problematic and maybe verge on extraction journalism? And are there any angles that maybe should be highlighted more on the juvenile level that aren't really in the adult criminal justice level?
You're asking I understand what Gabe means, and I'll address it. It's a very, very important point. So the idea of extractive journalism, which is we talk about it all the time at the Marshall Project, is that our journalists going into vulnerable communities and essentially extracting information, but they're not, they may be perpetuating damaging stereotypes, or not considering whether there are needs that particular community might have that you're jeopardizing or not meaning. So it's a very complicated set of questions that go into this. For example, we are not, we, the Marshall Project, are not an organization that is there to, for example, directly improve prison conditions by providing incarcerated people with soap or masks or so on. There are groups that do that, of course. What we do try to avoid being extractive, and this is something we think about a lot, is that we have a lot of two-way communication, and we have started, for example, we keep very large databases of families of the incarcerated, and we ask them, what issues do you think are not being covered? So we also had done right before COVID hit, we did the first of its kind poll in partnership with Slate, asking the political opinions and experiences of the incarcerated. So we offered them an outlet to talk about what their concerns were if they wanted to reform the criminal justice system, what in fact would be on their agenda. So we try, and through our showcasing of incarcerated people as writers, we try to give voices and make sure they are quoted and their perspectives are shared, which I think is much more common in the Marshall Project than most other news organizations. We have lines into people who are directly affected, and we try to surface their concerns. Now, of course, anytime you write about children in any context, we have to take special care. So with people who are in juvenile facilities, we have to make sure that an adult or an authority figure has consented. We have to make sure they're aware of what they might be saying and whether it jeopardizes them. We have to again, make sure that we're hearing their perspectives and surfacing things that matter to them, as well as the questions we might have in our mind. We learn a lot by listening to our audience, whoever that audience is, and whatever, and the people we report on are a kind of audience as well. So I'm not addressing specifically children, Gabe, but in the way that you asked. But what I mean is, I think these principles apply aboard, and then with young people, you do in fact have to apply special care. And in many cases, we can't give full names the way we might for adults, or there's certain information that, you know, they feel might be dangerous to them if it gets out, or cloud their future because they may not have criminal records under certain kinds of. So we are highly aware that when we write about juveniles in the justice system, that we have to take special care.
Thank you for that answer. We have time probably for one more question if anybody has one. In the meantime, I'm going to swing back to the question or the topic that we talked about at the beginning about if there are journalists who have stories that they think are interesting, that they would like to be involved with you. How does one do that?
Right. So are you asking how would people bring a story to the Marshall Project?
If you're a freelancer, or even if,
right.
like, if I, GBH wants to work with you.
Well,
like,
there are two sets of issues. We are very open to partnership, and if there are stories you think we can work well together, you should simply reach out to me or others. We are not able to accept very much freelance work, and I apologize for that. The reason is that we have very, very few editors, and so what we find is that we can sometimes accommodate freelancers, but most often we cannot. And we're usually working with other established news organizations where they have a set of editors and we have a set of editors. It's simply a bandwidth issue. And again, you know, it's not that we never, but we're small and our staff is producing a lot. So we kind of need, when we're partnering, we need another set of editors to help us just make sure that the piece is getting the kind of attention that it deserves, and that anyone who is a writer is getting the kind of careful and thoughtful editing that they deserve. So we're careful not to take something on where we can't do a good job with you. But certainly we have an email called pitches@themarshallproject.org, and that is where we filter through submissions from freelancers or others. And then again, if there's a project where you feel that we could partner well, you know, we're always happy to hear it. Again, there's a limit to what we can take on collaboratively for bandwidth, but we, for example, 538 reached out to us about this terrific story that we just published today. We were so happy to work with them on it. So, you know, always give us a try.
So basically the journalists work and the editors work together to kind of figure out a plan when you do it this way.
Right. We want to find out, are we the right match? You know, do we have the expertise that particular partner needs? Or will the partner, most of our projects are ones we do and then ask a partner if they would consider running. Sometimes we collaborate, but a lot of it is we're doing it. Would you Washington Post or Mother Jones or the Atlantic or you know, the Houston Chronicle, would you like this? We'll give it to you for free. Let's just run it together. Absolutely. No, we don't charge. We're a nonprofit organization. We're here to spread, you know, our whole mission is to improve coverage of criminal justice and awaken people to the issues that are important in that field.
One of the things we've been seeing during this crisis is also terrible stories of so many of our very accomplished journalists losing their jobs.
Yes.
How
Terrible.
has the Marshall Project been faring during this period of time?
Yes, well, thank you for asking. Fortunately, right now, we are lucky. We are not planning any furloughs or layoffs. We are tightening our belt for sure, because the economic conditions are such that we have to be prudent. We are supported by donations from foundations and from individual donors. So we're not dependent on advertising, and the advertising collapse has obviously hurt those entities that depend on advertising. But we understand that we're heading for an economic unknown, and that, you know, we are dependent on people's generosity, and if they have less to give, we may have less to receive. So we're trying to be prudent. but right now we've been able to keep full employment, which we very much want to do.
That's great to hear. I love some good news.
Yeah, we're trying hard. And we thank all our members and donors, because we've been very fortunate that, even small gifts, people will give just a little bit a month, and we're so grateful to them.
Well, thank you very much, Susan Chira, for spending this hour with us in New England. And it's really a great honor to meet you and hear about all
and you, Jenifer, and your great work. I'm really grateful to meet and talk to you and to answer all your questions. I very much appreciate your coming on a very busy news night and spending time with us.
Thank you. Well, so I hope, this was great. And thanks, Adam and SPJ, for organizing this. And good luck, everybody. Stay safe and well during this period of time. Thanks a lot.
Bye now.
Bye.